Hello everyone, this is the lecture titled Designing Peer Checklists and Rubrics for the Psychomotor Domain. In the next few modules we're going to look at the three major domains of learning: psychomotor, cognitive and affective, and talk about how we can design assessments within these three domains. So the obvious starting point is the psychomotor domain, because this is the domain of learning where most of our student learning outcomes and most of our objectives focus on. We are unique in the school system in that we are really the only subject area that teaches for outcomes within the psychomotor domain. Other subject areas teach for outcomes within the cognitive and affective domain, primarily the cognitive domain, but don't really touch on the psychomotor domain, where we're looking at movement and movement concepts. So as part of this discussion on how to develop assessments for the psychomotor domain, I'm going to combine the important concept of how to develop rubrics. Because unlike cognitive domain objectives, which can be easily assessed through written tests and other objective measures, for psychomotor objectives and human movement, the assessment of human movement, we often have to develop rubrics so that we can give some kind of evaluation to the student performance. So it makes sense to combine the development of rubrics and assessments within the psychomotor domain into the same lecture for this course. There are a few assignments attached to this module. There's 2 article reflections, and those articles are posted on Blackboard. There is also a rubric design assignment, which is worth 10% of your final grade, which I have gone ahead and put on the end of this lecture into a slide of its own, and I'll also put that criteria and a grading rubric, imagine that, for this assignment on Blackboard as well. So the psychomotor domain, the traditional assessments that we've used in this domain, and you may recall some of these from your own physical education experiences. Traditionally, we've had isolated skills tests and fitness tests where one at a time the student comes up and is asked to either perform a skill in front of the teacher, and the teacher kind of checks off or gives them some kind of evaluation on how well they perform that skill. Picture the class where one by one a student comes up to the serve line in tennis and does 3 tennis serves, and the teacher checks things off to tell them how well they did on that tennis serve. We still see elements of that, although the field has moved towards a more authentic and alternative method of assessment, where we don't waste so much time assessing, we build it into the day-to-day activities within the class. We're also going to talk about rubrics, and I'll probably use the word rubric 100 times in the next 30 or so minutes. So just be aware that rubrics are an important way for us to assess the assessment and to give students some kind of feedback and, if necessary, a grade on their performance on a psychomotor domain objective. I was going to have you do this discussion board thing at the bottom of this slide, but I think we'll skip that. But in your mind, as we're going through the next few slides, I'd like you to think about skills tests as we known them in the past, and how effective they are in giving us information on whether students can transfer those skills to gameplay or some kind of physical activity. And I think you'll agree that a controlled, isolated skills test might not be the best predictor of a student's ability to transfer those skills into a real-world situation. So we're going to talk about some alternative assessments and how we might assess those using rubrics. And I'll introduce the types of rubrics first and then provide some examples of different types of alternative and authentic assessments. Note that for the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to use the term alternative and authentic kind of hand in hand. It's the same thing. We'll look at some checklist rubrics, point system rubrics, analytical rubrics, holistic rubrics, and generalized and task-specific rubrics. And then I'll also throw in some logs as assessment techniques within the psychomotor domain into this lecture, mainly because they don't fit anywhere else. Please be aware that at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to develop one each of these types of rubrics and a log using your own ideas. So obviously you cannot just copy what I put onto the slides, or you cannot just copy what's in the scanned chapters that I'm providing on Blackboard. I want you to take something that you are teaching or that you would teach yourself and try to create your own rubrics so I can see that you've grasped this content. So checklist rubrics are the most simple. They provide a list of characteristics that are scored as a yes or no. Either the student can do it or they can't do it. They usually contain lots of traits or descriptors than other scoring guides, so you might see like 10 things that you're looking for because it's a simple yes no, as opposed to 3 things that you're looking for but it's more than a yes no. You're trying to rate them. So in a checklist there might be a whole bunch of things that you're looking for and it's a simple check or no check. Checklists can be used by the teacher, by the student, him or herself, from a video, or by a peer. So it can be used as a self-assessment, a peer assessment, or a teacher-based assessment. And we should keep in mind too that if we're working with younger children and you're doing some kind of peer assessment, then you probably need to use pictures or photographs or smiley faces or cartoon characters rather than words that might not be able to be read or understood. So here's an example of a very simple checklist rubric. This is designed to assess the presence of listed characteristics or traits, and you could figure out what this might be for as we read through this. And this is from one of the scanned chapters that I placed on Blackboard, so you can read the text associated with this. So as a simple yes or no check, does the student play within the rules of the game? Does not argue with others, shares in team responsibilities, gives others a chance according to the rules, follows the coach's instructions, respects team's efforts, offers encouragement, accepts calls, and accepts the outcome of the game. So this would be a nice little checklist rubric to use within the sport education model, which I know many of you are familiar with. So this would allow you to assign some kind of grade based on the student's participation in gameplay within the sport education model. Now you might argue that this is more affective domain than psychomotor domain, and I could understand that argument, but that's not really what's important here. What's important is that you understand how checklist rubric can be developed to assess some kind of student performance. Here's another checklist rubric, and obviously this is more in depth than the previous example. So this is for a unit on bowling, and it's a peer assessment. You can see at the top the bowler's name and the observer's name. So automatically we have someone doing something and then someone observing. This is related to Mostyn's teaching style called the reciprocal teaching style. So you can see the cues listed down the left along with the picture. Those are the things that the instructor or whoever designed this rubric has decided is important for this skill. You can see the critical elements listed of them, and there's 8. And then for each frame, you can see that there would be a checklist of yes or no on whether their partner was exhibiting those critical elements. So at the end of this, if the critical element of the ball being the highest on the backswing is number 4, if the bowler did it on the first 3 attempts but not on the second, on the 4th and 5th attempt, then they would get 3 out of 5 on that checklist for that critical element. So it's pretty simple. It's just taking a motor skill, a psychomotor skill, which is why this is psychomotor domain assessment. They've broken that skill down into parts, what NASB used to call critical elements. And then each time the student performs that movement, a peer, and again it could be the peer, it could be the teacher, it could be a self-assessment, they've evaluated on whether that was done correctly or incorrectly. So at the end of this lesson or the unit, the teacher will be able to assess the student and say whether they were meeting the student learning outcomes. So if the student learning outcomes were that the student will be able to bowl using correct technique 80% of the time, then the teacher will be able to use assessments like these to state whether the student and then how many students within the class had met that student learning outcome. So that's where this begins to tie together with the last module where we discuss student learning outcomes. Here's an example of a checklist rubric that might be used for middle school students, and this would be in a jump rope lesson or unit. And again, you can see the jumper's name and the observer's name, which immediately leads us to seeing this as a reciprocal style lesson based on Mostyn's spectrum. You can see the directions. Watch your partner jump rope 10 times for each of the jump. Check the critical elements you see consistently at least 3 times in a row. If you don't see it, leave it blank. And then you see they've done it for the forward jump and the backward jump. And then opportunity for formative feedback at the bottom there, where they can make some kind of statement on an improvement goal. So this is a nice, quick, easy to use checklist rubric that allows good feedback to the performer based on the critical elements of the skill. Here's one for high school students, and again these are from the scan chapter that's on Blackboard, for the overhand forehand clear in badminton. Very tricky shot. So in groups of 3, which is actually how Mostyn suggested the reciprocal style should operate, player 1 is the hitter, player 2 delivers a setup, player 3 observes and records. After 5 good setups, rotate positions and continue until everyone has been the hitter. And then using the rubric at the bottom here, the hitter is being observed and recorded by the observer and recorder. And for each time they perform the skill, the presence or non-presence of the 3 critical elements that have been identified in this skill are evaluated. Moving on, the next type of rubric that's just a wee bit more complicated is a point system rubric. They are very similar to checklists, but instead of a yes or no or presence absence of a critical element or the correct performance of a critical element, there's some kind of evaluation and point system, allowing us to weight some things more heavily than others. These can easily be converted to a grade if we want to do that, but remember, not all assessments have to be used for grading. Here's one that I use in my undergraduate class. Let's say that we've asked our students to create a routine, and it could be in a dance unit, or in this example it was in a step aerobics unit. We might have told them that there's 10 points available, and this rubric shows how those 10 points can be achieved. The obvious advantage here is that we can weight different criteria appropriately based on how important it is for the overall successful production of whatever it is you've asked the student to do. So here having the student have smooth transitions between steps is only allocated 1 point, but having them monitor their heart rate is worth double that, it's worth 2 points. So perhaps if this was for a grade, this student may receive a 9 out of 10 or a 90%. This scanned page, and this is in the chapter on Blackboard, is obviously more in depth, but it's the same concept. Instead of simple checklist of saying yes or no, there's different points available for each section of the student artifact. And indeed, this is a real-world example because many school districts are requiring their students in 9th grade to develop these fitness portfolios, and I think these are wonderful. I think having students do this in 9th grade is exactly what we should be doing to meet state and national standards, but also to prepare students to live healthy and active lifestyles, and also to help raise the credibility of our profession. This is exactly what physical education should be, in my opinion. So there's a fitness evaluation based on some of the tests that are embedded within FitnessGram. There's a fitness plan. There's a nutritional analysis, and then there's results, and then there's some outside activities at the bottom of this. So rather than giving students grades on how quickly, or really how slowly, they can run 2 miles of the track, really any grades associated with their fitness should be related to the development of this fitness portfolio, which takes students from where they're at, allows students to measure their current fitness levels, and to develop a plan, which includes nutrition, by the way, to help them improve. So this allows us to take students from where they are and push them on. And this is an example of a point system rubric. I hope you take some time to look at that, especially those of you that are going to be teaching in high schools. Moving along the continuum and getting more complex each time, the next type is an analytical rubric. These require a scorer's judgment, and you'll see why with the example. And we must evaluate the strength or weakness of the trait that we're looking for. And there's two main types: a quantitative analytical rubric, which uses numbers, and you'll see that on the example, and a qualitative analytical rubric, which uses words within each cell. Here's an example of a quantitative analytic rubric. You can see here that carefully observe your player and assess the components of gameplay. Use the scale 1 to 3 for your assessment. 1, not so good. 2, average. 3, they're good at it. Okay, so then you'd either watch your partner, or the teacher would use this watching students in the class. And after watching the student perform different strokes, they would give them a score 1, 2, or 3. So this is allowing you to provide some kind of judgment on the performance of those different criteria. This isn't a great scan, but hopefully you can see this. This is a qualitative rubric. So you could see here, there's actually numbers along the side here, but there's a very in-depth qualitative statement of what each score reflects. So this is a qualitative rubric because there's a qualitative statement for each part of the skill: shot execution, court movement, service. So you can see how whoever designed this rubric, there's a verbal description of the teacher's expectation for each of the point levels within each part of the skill. Holistic rubrics describe various levels of performance, and they try to group everything into one area. So whereas this example breaks it down into shot execution, court movement, service with lots of different scores, holistic rubrics just give us different levels. Here there's 4, but it might be 3 on others. And then it just describes everything. So it doesn't break the skill into separate parts. It just describes what it would look like. Now, these can be really useful for summative evaluation at the end of a unit. So maybe you've done a unit on tennis, and then on days 9, 10, 11, and 12, the students are playing a tennis ladder or doubles in some kind of tournament. Not an elimination tournament though, but a tournament where everyone's always playing. And you, the teacher, you can walk around and watch students play, and then based on what you see and the description within each of these levels, you could assign the students a 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, you could do that without a rubric based on what you think a 1, 2, 3, or 4 looks like. But if you wanted to relate this to a student's grade, you would have to defend what a 1, 2, 3, or 4 looks like. And that's easier to do if you have descriptions like this. So when a student comes to you and says, 20% of my grade in this class was for my tennis unit, and you gave me a 12 out of 20. Why? And you can say, well, you were at level 2, and this is where you were at in the gameplay at the end of the tennis unit. So if you're going to assign not so good grades, you need to have the assessment data to back that up. That's just being a good teacher. It's not covering your butt or anything silly like that. It's providing students with the data and the information that they need to get better, and also with the data and information to justify the grade you receive them in the class, as opposed to just giving students all A's. Okay, if we're serious about what we're doing and we write good student learning outcomes, then we must have effective assessments that measure those outcomes. Generalized and task-specific rubrics. Generalized rubrics are universal rubrics that can be used for most activities and most sports, and they become quite popular with statewide assessments, because theoretically you should be able to take a generalized rubric and apply it to any unit that you're teaching in 9th grade or in 5th grade. So it's looking for very generic or generalized things in the student's performance. So that you can see this here. This is a gameplay rubric for invasion games. So for any kind of invasion game where students are trying to attack another team's area, or to score a goal, or to get into some kind of end zone. So you might think flag football, ultimate frisbee, soccer, all of those types of invasion games. This rubric should cover all of those, and it's put into different areas that you can see on this slide. So again, the purpose of a generalized rubric is that it should be able to apply to a broad category of activities. Task-specific rubrics are created for individual assessment tasks. They're more reliable than generalized rubrics because they're specific, obviously. So in this one here, this is a task-specific rubric. It's task-specific for certain sports that are similar to each other. So here you could see from tennis to badminton how this task-specific rubric has just been modified slightly to a very similar sport, just by slightly changing the skills involved. I'm not going to talk too much about this type of rubric because they're not overly used, they're not overly exciting, and honestly I don't think you'll use them that much, or certainly not as much as the rubrics discussed earlier on. Whatever rubric you choose, it should be valid and reliable. You should be considered with construct validity. Does it measure what it's intending to measure? And then you should be concerned about reliability. Does it consistently produce the same results? So if you watch a student perform one skill today and you assess them using a rubric, you should see the same thing tomorrow and probably the day after. that's dealing with reliability. Let's talk a little bit about logs. So not really a rubric, and can be used for all the domains, not just psychomotor domain, but we'll talk about them in this lecture. So logs are generally self-assessment tools that help students record and track their progress. They can be very good in keeping students accountable for staying on task within a lesson, so you can use a log within a lesson, and many physical best activities use a log. Or they can be good for having students record over days, over time, their progress within fitness units. So here you can see a fitness log for high school students. As soon as you enter the gym, pick up your log and a pencil. Go through as many stations as possible until time is called. Follow the directions for each station. Record your personal best at each station. Use your records to show a new personal best goals each week. Be sure to set a new goal for each station. Curl-ups, push-ups, sit and reach, jump rope. So in addition to providing an assessment that is written down where you can see how well students did, it also provides a motivation element for the students, so they can see each day what they did the day before, and they can set goals to try and beat that. I've personally watched many interns use these types of logs within station work, and it can be very, very powerful in keeping students on task and motivated. Game performance. Game performance can be very challenging to assess student psychomotor performance. It's a lot easier for us to assess skills, psychomotor skills such as kicking, throwing, serving, striking in isolated skills test situation. However, there's been a very strong movement away from that towards more authentic assessment where we measure students' performance in real-world situations to see if they can actually transfer those skills from isolated practice trials into a situation where they're actually using them within a game. There's this instrument within our profession called the Game Performance Assessment Instrument. It received a lot of attention when it came out, and I don't necessarily want you to be really experienced in this instrument, but I want you to know it's out there, that there is a checklist instrument out there that allows you to assess how well students perform within game situations. It's called the GPAI, the Game Performance Assessment Instrument, and it was first reported in 1998 and has received lots of attention since. It's designed to provide a means of observing and coding performance behaviors. It includes behaviors that demonstrate ability to solve tactical problems by making decisions, moving appropriately, and executing skills. And it was originally designed to conduct research and measuring gameplay and activity, but has since been used by many teachers to assess students in game playing activities. So if you have your students play small-sided games, ultimate frisbee, flag football, soccer, softball, speedball, lacrosse, if you have them playing a lot of those games, you could use this instrument to assess their performance within those games. This is referenced in one of the articles, so make sure you're reading both articles, obviously, but be aware that there's a section on the GPAI within one of the articles. Obviously, I selected that article on purpose for you to read up on this. There's two scoring methods within the GPAI. There's a tally system for slower paced sports, which provides a more precise performing measure, so you're recording or tallying behaviors as you see them. This is often used with research, so there can be objectification of behaviors and statistical analysis of data. There's a 1 to 5 system, which is easy with invasion games and some net war games, primarily used by the teacher. Not as accurate, which you don't need to be if it's just assessment as opposed to research data. So you'll best understand this by reading the article, but as an example, a soccer GPAI might be broken down into decisions made, skill execution, and support. And there might be a tally to mark the appropriate category each time a student makes a decision within each of those areas. So take a look at that, how we look at the decisions made, skill execution, and support, and then read up on the article, and you can see how this might be used in a real world situation. I don't want to get into this because honestly I don't see many teachers using this in the field because it's pretty complex and takes up too much time. But just be aware that the model does call for a simple calculation where you take the decision making numbers, skill execution numbers, and support numbers, and you divide them by each other, and then do a little equation at the end to give you an overall number. So the people who did design this came up with this simple mathematical equation where you could come up with an individual number that represents someone's game playing ability. If you're into this, you're really into this, then go ahead and find the full version of the GPAI, and you can simply Google that to find it. Have a good look through it and maybe see if it's something that you could use in your teaching. Game performance assessment instrument for invasion games. So here you can see the observation dates, the scoring key, and then 1 to 5. This is an example of the system that the teacher might use rather than the researcher might use. Names of students would go down here, and then you could see that for skill execution, decision making, support, that each student would get a rating on these here. This is actually from the Tactical Games book, I believe. Okay, so some general suggestions on that. If you're going to use that instrument, you should use it for more than just one lesson to get reliable data and to become familiar with how to use that. Start slow and progress, and maybe teach students how to assess each other, which is a good process to implement anyway. It used to be kind of considered that it's wasted time if students are assessing each other. It's wasted time where students could be practicing the skill themselves. But there actually is research that shows that assessment time, especially within the peer assessment or reciprocal teaching style, where students are assessing each other, it's not wasted time, but rather it's reinforcing the cognitive elements of the skill as they're watching other people do it, especially if they're providing feedback to the other person on their performance and how to improve their performance based on the critical elements. So I think we need to differentiate between wasted time where students are assessing each other and wasted time from when students are just watching each other and not doing anything. There are other ways to assess game performance. The GPAI doesn't have a monopoly on this market. Seedentop, who you might recognize from the designer of the sport education model, Hastie and Van der Mars, who are big names in the field of physical education. They've designed rubrics for several activities, which have been stated as being good for assessment, but not necessary for research purposes. And many of those are available in the sport education book that we use in our undergraduate class here, that I have a copy if you're interested. Other ways to assess game performance. Some states have got involved in this. South Carolina, their assessment program that's been around for several years now, they designed rubrics that could be used in elementary, middle, and high schools. And there is a link there. I won't click on it, but you can see some of those rubrics. And then just wrapping this up now, at the conclusion of this lecture, We know that using rubrics can enhance the quality of physical education, can enhance student learning. Rubrics are very useful when you're talking about the psychomotor domain because it allows you to provide statements on what you're looking for within a certain skill production, or what you're looking for to be able to say whether students met certain student learning outcomes that you wrote for that lesson. Going into the assessment of psychomotor domain objectives without rubrics is very awkward and very ineffective. Basically, you're making statements on how well students performed things without having any proof on how well they perform those things, which in this age of accountability and assessment probably isn't going to fly. Okay, so it's very important as effective educators that you understand the importance of student learning outcomes and designing rubrics and assessments that measure those outcomes so you can state with some degree of confidence on whether students met the outcomes that you designed for that lesson. The assignments attached to this module are those article reflections, 5% each, as with the other modules, and the rubric assignment. Here is the rubric assignment. I would like you to take a physical education activity that you currently teach or plan on teaching and design a rubric for the psychomotor domain with these rubrics listed below. At the top of each rubric, tell me what type of rubric it is, whether it's a checklist, point system, etc. Okay, the types of rubrics that I want you to design are the ones that I think are the most important. I want you to design a checklist rubric, a point system rubric, a quantitative analytical rubric, a qualitative analytical rubric, an holistic rubric, and a log. Okay, for some kind of activity, and they can be different activities. So you might do jump rope here and soccer here, etc., etc. You can change it up as you go along. I would like you to put all 6 of them. It's not 7, so there's a typo. I'd like you to put all 6 of them into one Word document and submit that one Word document on Blackboard. Title it as Module 4, Assignment, and then your last name with some underscores on those to separate those words. For example, Module 4, Assignment -Elliot. You can use resources, but I don't expect to see any copied material. And I will check, but I don't expect it to be an issue. I don't want you just going to the internet and going to PE Central and just ripping off one of their rubrics that they already have. I want you to create a rubric for each of those 6 things, or the 6th one just being a straight up log. You can use the examples in this PowerPoint to guide you, and in the chapters, scan chapters and articles to guide you. And I hope you do that. So the majority of the work in this module will be you designing these rubrics. And with that in mind, I'll give you plenty of time to complete this module. And I'll put the due dates on Blackboard so you can see that. Okay, this is important. It's 10% of your final grade. And please follow the directions in terms of labeling each one and making sure they're all in one document. Okay, contact me if you have any questions. That concludes this lecture.